Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to thank Michaela and Nikki for the original invitation, and then Willy and Dietmar for the excellent organization. I'm not a scholar of Girard. I mean, after the invitation, I started to read him and to see how I could combine his insight with my research on migration, the refugee crisis, on neoliberalism and biopolitics. And I got completely hooked to Girard. I think his arguments are fascinating. I found a number of perspectives that resonate with Foucault and therefore very relevant to my research. So what I will try to do today is to share some reflection on the European refugee crisis from a Girardian perspective. And this is started as a presentation, but then has become part of a broader project. I mean, I hope this to become a chapter in my next book, which focuses on the transformation of citizenship in Europe, and as part of that looks at the European refugee crisis. I generally don't read presentations, but since I feel I'm quite new with Girard, I will take a more cautious approach, so we'll mostly be reading, so bear with me for that. So here we go. It is hardly controversial to say that the European refugee crisis has been characterized by a widespread politics of fear. The rising number of people that over the last few years has crossed the Mediterranean on overcrowded and unseaworthy vessels in order to escape poverty, war, and persecution, over 1 million people in 2015, has been variously described as a flow, a flood, the rising tide, an invasion, and a stream of migrants inundating Europe that threatens its identity, economic livelihood, and Europe's cultural and religious foundations. Now, this imaginary of catastrophe has been iterated in several repertoires, yet I believe all of them revolve around the same question, and the question is the problem of difference, the fear of difference. Let me give you a few examples. In the UK, for instance, the debate about immigration, both documented and undocumented, has long been dominated by the fear of being, and I quote, swamped by people with a different culture. This is a statement, a very famous or infamous one, made by Margaret Thatcher in 1978. Now, this fear being swamped has been revived by the two latest prime ministers, David Cameron, who described the refugees as a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean, trying to illegally break into Britain without permission. Theresa May, the current prime minister, pledged to get rid of them by creating a hostile environment. Meanwhile, in France, Marine Le Pen has compared the influx of migrants to the barbarian invasions of the 4th century. So she has argued that while a catastrophic globalization has ravaged the French economy and jobs have faded away, immigrants have flooded in, many of them Muslim immigrants from North Africa. Marine Le Pen has argued, and I quote, "They are draining resources, rejecting French values, and transforming the culture." Now, the Muslim identity of the refugees has emerged as a main source of anxiety, and their alleged difference has been emphasized by political parties and leaders all across Europe. In their manifest, the German party Alternative for Deutschland has explicitly stated that Germany rests on Judeo-Christian and humanist foundations, and that Islam does not belong to Germany, as it is incompatible with its legal system and culture. Now, it's worth noting that this argument is not radically dissimilar from what Angela Merkel said in 2010 in relation to the problem of multiculturalism and the integration of Islam in Germany. Merkel remarked in 2010, "We in Germany feel tied to Christian values. Those who don't accept them don't have a place here." Now, Merkel significantly changed her position later in 2015 after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, when she expressed support for multiculturalism and Muslims in Europe, and indeed welcomed almost 1 million refugees from Syria to Germany. Now, Eastern European countries have most vocally raised the question of the Muslim identity of the refugees. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, has stated, "Islam does not belong to Europe. Those arriving have been raised in another religion and represent a radically different culture. Most of them are not Christians, but Muslims, and every single one of them poses a public security and terror risk. Now, similar remarks have been made by political leaders in Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and Cyprus. Czech President Miloš Zeman has warned that Muslim refugees won't respect local laws and mores and will try to implement Sharia law. For Matteo Salvini, Italy's deputy prime minister and head of the populist right-wing party Lega, most of those coming to Europe are not refugees, but illegal immigrants. They are culturally, religiously, and ethnically different. And without a sustained attempt to curb immigration, Europe will soon turn into a Muslim caliphate. Now, Salvini has routinely stated that the illegal immigrants are a threat because they commit more crimes than the Italians, and because they are bringing diseases such as tuberculosis and scabies, which have long been defeated in Europe. And I should note in passing that both statements are factually wrong. Now, in different guises, these arguments share the same denominator. Refugees and undocumented migrants in Europe are a threat because they are different, whether culturally different, religiously different, economically different, in the sense they are extremely poor, socially or ethnically different. Now, the underlying idea of these views is that difference prompts conflict, which means that sameness produces peace. Now, this is a seemingly intuitive and uncontroversial argument which has gained growing legitimacy in both public and academic circles. It has been propped up by popular theses such as Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, and its idea that civilizational differences revolving around culture and religion will be the main sources of conflict in the aftermath of the Cold War. Now, in the remaining time of this presentation, I would like to challenge this argument with the help of René Girard. Now, according to Girard, proximity and sameness rather than difference are the main causes of conflict. Difference, he argues, is a system of established hierarchies and recognized social roles which keep in check the conflicts arising from mimetic desire by acting as a mechanism of external mediation. As Wolfgang Palaver explains in relation to Girard's argument, as the world turns seemingly more egalitarian and traditional social hierarchies, roles, and structures crumble, the metaphysical distance between desiring subject and model diminishes. Now, the effect is that the potential for rivalry and violence increases. The more negligible this distance becomes, the more probable it is that mimesis will end in rivalry and violence. Now, for Girard, this transformation is insightfully captured by Tocqueville in his book, Democracy in America. According to Tocqueville, and I quote, "When all the privileges of birth and fortune are abolished, when all professions are accessible to all, and a man's own energies may place him at the top of any one of them, an easy and unbounded career seems to open to his ambition, and he will readily persuade himself that he is born to no common destinies." However, Tocqueville continues, the same equality that allows every citizen to conceive these lofty hopes renders all the citizens less able to realize them. It circumscribes their powers on every side, while it gives freer scope to their desire because they have opened the door to universal competition. I think these words are remarkably prescient of the current neoliberal order, which has replaced traditional hierarchies and structures with a self-disciplining mechanism of competition underpinned by a logic of unbounded desire. The original promise of neoliberalism was the satisfaction of desire in the form of market equilibrium, economic reward, material growth, and virtually unlimited consumption, in exchange for a social order based on individualism, greed, envy, and rivalry. The satisfaction of desire would act as a mechanism of social coordination and regulation, which channeled violence into competition. However, as numerous commentators have noted, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, neoliberalism has undergone a remarkable qualitative transformation. Marked by a relentless pattern of crisis, poor economic growth, declining social mobility, and growing inequality, neoliberalism has increasingly relinquished the triumphalist narrative of being able to generate material wealth that would trickle down to the poorest part of society and the poorest countries. As Mitchell Dean observes, neoliberalism's primary focus is now, and I quote, to fashion ways to make individuals, communities, systems, and organizations fit for the rigors of the catastrophe yet to come. Now, in this neoliberalism of crisis, the promise of satisfaction of desire is no longer sufficient to channel violence into extreme individualism, greediness, envy, and market competition, because neoliberalism is unable to deliver on its promise of growth for the masses. It can only deliver this promise for the few. Violence thus requires a new outlet, a new target, a new sacrificial victim, a scapegoat, as Girard would describe it. This role, I want to argue, has been assigned to the refugees and undocumented migrants. To this end, what neoliberalism has done is not to increase the difference between Europeans and undocumented migrants, quite the opposite. Neoliberalism has reduced this distance. It has established a new proximity by creating a class of socially destitute and economically marginalized Europeans who, particularly over the last 10 years, have seen their wealth, social opportunities, standards of living, and possibility of consumption sharply declining. So what I wish to suggest is that at its core, the European refugee crisis has not been governed by the fear of difference, but by the fear of sameness. The undocumented migrant has become the mirror image, the mimetic double of the impoverished European subject. In different ways, they are both uprooted, poor, marginalized, and at the mercy of forces they often do not understand, let alone control. The fear of sameness at the heart of European responses to the refugee crisis has been deliberately constructed and socially engineered through neoliberalism, and particularly in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, through neoliberal policies of austerity. So let me elaborate on this idea, on how austerity has contributed to establish a proximity and identity between the European dispossessed and the refugees flowing to Europe, and therefore how austerity has become the condition of possibility of a process of scapegoating of refugees in Europe. So first of all, austerity, a definition. Austerity can be described as the policy of cutting the state's budget to promote growth, and is often accompanied by a series of reforms, such as privatization and the regulation of the labor market. In times of austerity, governments make a significant cut to public expenditures, including healthcare, education, public transports, welfare transfers like child allowances and disability benefits. The goal is to reduce public debt. Now, in Europe, austerity has been the main response to the so-called Eurozone or European sovereign debt crisis starting in 2009. As Mark Blyth explains, the price of austerity has been paid first and foremost by those in the middle or the bottom half of the income and wealth distribution, who rely on indirect government services, such as tax breaks and subsidies, and on direct government services, such as transfers, public transport, public education, and healthcare. As we know, the effect of austerity have been quite dramatic. 10 years into austerity, and 22% of the EU population are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. This includes 25% of children, 23% of women, 18% of those over 65. 7% of Europeans live in severe material deprivation. 17% of Europeans live on less than 60% of their country's median household income. 9.3% of Europeans live in households where no one has a job. The significant impoverishment of large sections of the European population has been accompanied by the sustained growth of inequality, with a significant increase in the concentration of wealth in the hands of the richest strata of society. Of course, the impact of austerity has been uneven across Europe. It has been harsher on southern European countries, in particular on Greece, where the harsh package of austerity measures imposed by the EU, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, the so-called Troika, has brought the country on the brink of collapse in 2013, with 25% unemployment, 44% of the Greek population with an income below the poverty line, and the collapse of public health and education. But the impact of austerity has also been particularly harsh on Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, often derogatorily described with the acronym PIGS, all countries which were characterized, some of which are still characterized, by a relatively higher level of public debt compared to the rest of the Eurozone. Now, this brings us to the question, why austerity as a response to the Eurozone crisis? The conventional narrative is that the crisis beginning in 2009 was a sovereign debt crisis, that is, a crisis of public finances caused by negligent governments which had indulged in overspending. This irresponsible overspending, the dominant narrative goes, had been particularly pronounced for the southern European countries. As European scholar James Caporaso explained in a recent article in the Journal of Common Market Studies, and I quote, "There are two Europes. First, there is Northern Europe, which is fiscally responsible, works hard, invests wisely, and lives within its means. Northern Europe includes Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and Finland. Then there is Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, which is fiscally lax, doesn't work harder, engages in periodic consumption binges, and does not save, invest, and grow. It's a story of virtue versus indulgence, saints and sinners, Calvinists and Catholics." End of quote. Now, what's the problem with this narrative? It's wrong. It's plainly wrong. It presents us with a culturally racist and moralizing tale that conceals how the crisis beginning in 2009 in Europe was first and foremost a banking crisis. It was a crisis of private debt, which was eventually turned into a public debt crisis. Now, I don't have the time to elaborate on the mechanics of the crisis, but there are two elements I would like to point out, the two main components of the crisis, and both of which have to do with neoliberal greed and the goal of maximization of profits. First of all, European banks over-leveraged. That is, they reduced their equity and increased their debt to a level considerably higher than their American counterparts. Second, European banks massively invested in European peripheral sovereign debt, that is, on the sovereign debt of countries such as Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, most of all Greece, in order to reap the higher yields on bonds compared to those offered by other countries in the Eurozone, such as Germany. Now, this investment strategy was based on a fundamental moral hazard. Since the over-leveraging had resulted in a banking asset footprint that largely exceeded the GDP of their countries, a bank's default would have had catastrophic consequences for the Eurozone. Hence, European banks implicitly relied on the assumption that European countries would have rescued them should a crisis occur. Eventually, this is precisely what happened. When liquidity froze on global markets as a result of the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, and European banks found themselves unable to fund their debt and the normal low rates they had accessed until then, the concrete threat of a failure of the European banking system emerged. So the reaction was quick. European governments, together with the European Central Bank and the IMF, engineered a massive bailout with public money. The banking debt crisis was transformed into a sovereign debt crisis. This required constructing a narrative which transferred the responsibility of the crisis from the banks for their moral hazard, and the political elites for failing to prevent this moral hazard, to a scapegoat. So the first scapegoat was Greece. Let me say a few things about this. According to Girard, a scapegoat effect is, and I quote, that strange process through which two or more people are reconciled at the expense of a third party who appears guilty or responsible for whatever ails, disturbs, or frightens the scapegoaters. They feel relieved of their tensions and they coalesce into a more harmonious group. They now have a single purpose, which is to prevent the scapegoat from harming them by expelling or destroying him. End of quote. Greece, the Greek government, and the Greek people became the scapegoat. Now, I'm not disputing that Greece had built a massive public debt, which it struggled to service. But its responsibility, the responsibility of Greece for threatening the stability of the European banking system and Europe as a whole, were blown out of proportion. The reason is that the narrative of Greece as sole responsible was instrumental to relieve the banks of their responsibilities. Accordingly, depiction of the Greeks as lazy, incompetent, and greedy inundated the public debate. Greece, it was argued, and these are a series of quotes from newspapers and politicians, Greece poses as big a risk to the global economy and financial markets as the collapse of Lehman Brothers did in September 2008. According to Angela Merkel, Greece should have not been allowed into the EU in the first place. For the OECD, the Greek debt crisis was spreading like Ebola. Greece was described as the developed world's most crooked economy lying in the cradle of Western civilization, which could trigger a devastating domino effect. The strategy of Greek scapegoating was then accompanied by a further declension of the scapegoat effect, which I would like to describe as self-scapegoating. So what is this? The narrative of self-scapegoating can be described as follows. We, the people of Europe, are responsible for the crisis because we have relied too much on a disruptive culture of welfare dependency, and if we do not embrace harsh austerity measures, we will end up like Greece. The country that has been championing this narrative is the United Kingdom, and particularly its Prime Minister, David Cameron. While in office, he repeatedly asserted that, and I quote, ending Britain's welfare culture was a moral mission. For Cameron, the causes of the 2008 crash had to do with labor overspending as part of a culture of welfare dependency, which for years has paid British people not to work. Hence, in 2010, Cameron declared, the age of welfare irresponsibility will give way to the age of responsible austerity. Now, this discourse has contributed to construct welfare provisions as morally and socially despicable, and accordingly, to describe welfare recipients as benefit scroungers, as a weak and morally corrupt lot that lives at the expenses of the healthy and laborious part of the population. Now, this narrative mimics the one that describes the refugees as bogus, undeserving, a swarm of scroungers, spongers, fraudsters. These are some of the key words to describe the refugees that have been used in the tabloids in the UK. Refugees were intent on robbing the system and place an unduly burden on its laborious population. So what I want to suggest is that the neoliberal policy of austerity has contributed to establish a remarkable identity and a close proximity between the European dispossessed and the refugees flowing to Europe. As I've briefly discussed, their sameness does not rest solely on their social displacement, economic disposability, and material destitution. The European dispossessed by austerity and the refugees flowing to Europe have become mimetic doubles because both groups have become the object of stigmatization in the public opinion. In the case of the European dispossessed, because they have been increasingly portrayed as if they were responsible for their situation and if social protection was a luxury in times of austerity. Whereas in the case of the undocumented migrants, because they have been either described as fake or as responsible for their forced displacement and for robbing Europeans of their scarce resources in a time of austerity. So what austerity has done is to reduce the distance between the European dispossessed and the refugees, with the effect of collapsing the distinction between citizens and strangers in need and the related notions of human rights, refugee protection, and duties of hospitality. Austerity has engendered competition for scarce resources, homes, jobs, health services, and welfare provisions, to the point that the refugees, rather than the European economic and financial elites, have been blamed for their shortages. Refugees have been turned into the ultimate scapegoats of Europe and its financial crisis. Now, as Girard reminds us, and I quote, the principal source of violence between human beings is mimetic rivalry. The rivalry resulting from imitation of a model who becomes a rival, or of a rival who becomes a model. In the European refugee crisis, refugees have been successfully constructed as rivals who come here to rob us of our scarce resources, and any attempt to resist this narrative by showing or practicing a more humane model of solidarity and a more compassionate politics of hospitality, has been increasingly branded as do-gooding, political correctness, weakness, lack of identity, naivety, left-wing elitism, Marxism, lack of love for one's country, betrayals of one's own people, privileging strangers of a member, philo-Islamism, and so on. Equally, the dominant narrative has managed to turn the rival refugee into a model, hence the portrayal of the refugees as benefit scroungers who are allegedly who are allegedly given privileged access to all services, schools, and other welfare provisions that are often denied to native Europeans. Neoliberal austerity has managed to instill in the European dispossessed the desire for the desires of the refugees, these entitled strangers who are seemingly offered the good life that Europeans are denied, and has managed to create an artificial scarcity that, following Girard, has established these two groups as each other's conflictual doubles, or twins. In such situations, Girard warns, hierarchies and established social roles disintegrate, and prohibitions are transgressed. The unthinkable becomes thinkable, as the only way to purge the community of its own disorder and suffering becomes to unite and coalesce against the antagonist. The refugee becomes responsible for the misery and the deprivation of the European dispossessed. It is the scapegoat, the surrogate victim that needs to be immolated and sacrificed in order to save Europe. Yet, Girard adds, and I quote, "A scapegoat effect that can be acknowledged as such by the scapegoaters is no longer effective. It is no longer a scapegoat effect. The victim must be perceived as truly responsible for the troubles that come to an end when it's collectively put to death." This dynamic can be observed in the 2013 decision of the European Union to suspend Mare Nostrum, a search and rescue mission in the Mediterranean that over the previous year had saved over 150,000 people. Now, two main reasons were put forward for this decision. The first reason was that the mission was considered to be an unintended pull factor, which basically encouraged more migrants to cross the Mediterranean and therefore encouraged more life to be lost at the sea. Now, this argument performed the dual construction of refugees as fundamentally responsible and of the European Union as a responsible civilized actor, primarily concerned with the well-being of the refugees. The decision to suspend search and rescue missions in 2013 has resulted in a significant increase in the number of migrant deaths in the Mediterranean, from 437 in 2014 to 2,078 in 2015 to 2,900 in 2016. Consistently with Girard's argument, this sacrifice, the sacrifice of the scapegoated undocumented migrants, has not only been committed in denial, but has also been presented as a humanitarian act aimed at saving lives. The second reason for suspending Mare Nostrum was that at roughly €9 million a month, this mission was considered very expensive. Most of the costs were sustained by Italy. In 2014, Italy requested a stronger contribution from the EU, but its demand was rejected. As a result, Italy suspended Mare Nostrum, and Mare Nostrum was replaced by the EU Frontex Operation Triton, aimed solely at border patrolling and with a budget of €3 million a month. So I would like to bring this presentation to a conclusion by suggesting some financial equivalences. To save Europe's banking system between 2008 and 2011, the European Commission approved 4.5 trillion euros in aid to the financial sector. This is equivalent to almost 37% of the EU GDP. In order to stimulate the economy and smooth the effects of the harsh austerity measures, the European Commission in the same period approved the European Economic Recovery Plan at a total cost of 200 billion across the EU, equivalent to 1.5% of the EU GDP. In order to save the lives of undocumented migrants in the Mediterranean, the EU considered that €9 million a month were too much. €9 million a month equate on a yearly basis to 0.0000065% of the EU GDP. There are 5 zeros, or 6, many zeros. The reason, as I've argued in this presentation, is that the undocumented migrants have to die because they are the necessary scapegoat, the surrogate victim that is needed to relieve the European dispossessed from the suffering caused by neoliberal austerity. The undocumented migrants have become the mimetic doubles of the European dispossessed as part of a neoliberal transformation that has removed traditional social hierarchies and structures only by replacing them with a widespread sense of disentitlement and deprivation that has fueled violence and resentment towards disenfranchised strangers. The scapegoat effect, so aptly described by Girard, I want to conclude, is an essential and endogenous and integral part of neoliberalism. I think this speaks to the importance and foresight of Girard's work and its relevance for understanding and possibly resisting the neoliberal politics of fear and scapegoating. Thank you.